there are regular waves of popular sentiment that originate with some trusted source or other and then get passed around from photographer to photographer until they become some kind of unofficial credo. Kit lenses are shit. You're not a real photographer unless you're shooting full manual. Never shoot above ISO 400, etc., etc., blah, blah, bloody blah. This shared wisdom is often incorrect, particularly when it comes to gear and software, and yet you see the same bollocks being touted as inside information on blogs, in magazines, and in YouTube videos. And if you've seen a blog article or YouTube video extolling the virtues of Capture One and suggesting that it's time to ditch Lightroom, then, my friends, you've seen the hype machine in full effect. Adobe Lightroom might be the most popular RAW editor / digital asset manager on the market, but it's a long way from being the oldest. Capture One isn't the original either, but since it was released in 1994, nearly a decade before Adobe released Camera Raw, and over 12 years before Lightroom came out, it certainly has a much longer history. Capture One was originally released purely to edit photos taken on the Phase 1 camera system, so they've had nearly 30 years to get their shit together. And the truth is that Capture One has been a popular app with professional photographers for a long time. That much is not disputed. Lately, however, I've been seeing more and more articles suggesting that Capture One is superior in every way to Adobe Lightroom or other RAW editors, and that no matter what kind of photography you're into, you're an idiot if you don't make the switch. So I thought I'd shed some light on the strengths and weaknesses of this software and explain why, for most people, pretty much any other RAW editor on the planet, or indeed any other planet, is a better choice than Capture One. Much of the hype about Capture One has come from the professional portrait or studio photographers, and the simple fact is that for portrait and studio work, it's a decent enough app. As one experienced studio photographer put it on Reddit recently, Capture One has been battle tested. We can't risk million-dollar budget shoots with a program that has AI or anything new. And for me, this quote gets to the heart of the problem. It's a niche application that lends itself well to the highly particular requirements of studio work, and its user base are happy to stick with a primitive tool set in the name of reliability. The problem is that the marketing narrative has shifted towards a more generalized photography crowd, and the suggestion has been made that it's a great choice for real estate or landscape or astrophotographers. And that's also the point where I exit the hype train in the style of Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me. The requirements of a landscape photographer, or even just the general hobbyist photographer who's shooting a little bit of everything, are vastly different to the needs of a professional studio photographer. Everything about Capture One is created with the studio photographer in mind, and is simply not a great choice for pretty much anyone else. From an asset management perspective, Capture One is slightly better than Photolab or Luminar Neo, but nowhere near as capable as Lightroom. Features such as the automatic group view, which bundles similar looking photos together, and multiple camera options are only of use for studio work, and there's only the most basic support for things like location-based searches. It does have good smart albums and metadata filters, but again, they are nowhere near as granular as Adobe Lightroom's. It also lacks Lightroom's plugin architecture, which enables you to extend its capabilities in myriad directions. No distinction is made between the asset management side of the app and the raw editing side. In Capture One, yes, you can create a grid view of images, which you can stick on a second screen if required, but it's just window dressing. The Cull Images window is probably the most useful part of the asset management in Capture One, although its most notable feature, grouping, is singularly useless for landscape shots. But let's get into the nitty gritty, the actual raw editing, because a lot has been said about how Capture One does a far better job of this than other raw editors. The key to all raw editors is a process called demosaicing. This process combines red, green and blue image data collected by an image sensor, which is overlaid with a color filter array. Most cameras use Bayer filters, and the problem is that the information collected by those Bayer filters is not complete, and either the camera, if you're shooting in JPEG, or the computer software, if you're shooting in RAW, needs to fill in some gaps. And because all cameras and all RAW editors use slightly different algorithms, the end results are therefore always slightly different too. When I tested Capture One on hundreds of RAW files, I found its RAW engine to be more aggressive than other RAW editors, and the images it rendered to be over sharp. This might not be a problem when you're talking about a portrait shot of a human being, but nobody wants sharp edges on a cloud. This leads me to believe that, in keeping with Capture One's loyal client base, they've tuned their demosaicing algorithm specifically towards portrait photography. In any case, I saw absolutely no evidence of it rendering RAW files any better than Lightroom. Quite the opposite, in fact. Ultimately, the way a RAW is edited is a largely subjective issue, and what looks good to one photographer's eye might look substandard to another's. From a technical perspective, I did not find Capture One any better in terms of dynamic range, highlight recovery and shadow detail than Lightroom, ACR or Photolab. In fact, of those applications, Photolab has consistently proved the most capable in this regard. The Capture One fan base love to bang on about how fast their software is, but in my testing I found the exact opposite. When using the high dynamic range sliders for highlights and shadows, I experienced a second or more of lag between moving the slider and the preview rendering. It was even worse when I used the dehaze slider. Moving that slider back and forth made my iMac feel incredibly sluggish. I decided to compare its speed with the dehaze sliders in Lightroom using the same photograph, and the difference was staggering. Lightroom's render was near instantaneous, while Capture One's felt like it was slowed by treacle. In pretty much every test I tried with Capture One, Lightroom was always faster, sometimes staggeringly so. Capture One was slower to import, slower to update when editing, slower when zooming in or out, and slower to search. I can only assume that all of these people who claim that Capture One is much faster than Lightroom haven't used Adobe's application for a few years, because they'd be in for a bit of a surprise if they did. And then we come to masking, and oh boy, was this a surprise. Masking is one of the most powerful and heavily utilized tools in the photographer's toolbox. I'd heard great things about Capture One's capabilities in this regard, so I was surprised to discover that it had far and away the worst masking capabilities of any RAW editor I've ever tested. Capture One's masking sucks so badly that I can only assume its cheerleaders never actually use it. If they had, then they'd have discovered, as I did, that it's slow, primitive, and excruciatingly awkward to use. Firstly, there are no AI masking tools at all. Sure, it has a tool called Magic Brush, but I can only assume that its name is some hilariously ironic joke by the programming team. It is magic only in the sense that it always manages to precisely mask out the wrong parts of the image. I reckon I could do a better job with the freehand marquee tool in Photoshop. The Magic Brush operates a bit like the regular brush tool in Lightroom, but Lightroom's auto mask capabilities are far superior to Capture One's. And anyway, Adobe have rolled out brilliant AI masking tools which enable you to create sophisticated masks in less time than it takes Capture One's dehaze slider to move from east to west. Do the Capture One hype crew know that Lightroom now enables you to select people automatically using AI, and then to automatically mask out parts of their body such as their hair or teeth? There is nothing that gets within a million miles of those sort of capabilities in Capture One, and since it's a tool pitched at studio photographers, I'd have thought this would be something they'd find useful. Capture One's masking is woeful. You cannot even add or subtract from a mask. I had a look on Capture One's own support forum, and it turns out that their increasingly pissed off customers have been banging on about simple add subtract functionality for years and years. One of the reasons that many photographers made that jump from Adobe to Capture One was because Adobe introduced subscription-based licensing, and Capture One could be purchased outright. And that's a fair enough reason. I can fully understand why there's a pushback against subscriptions and why someone might prefer to own their software outright. But the problem is this: even with a subscription licensing system, Adobe's photography bundle is considerably cheaper than Capture One. Here in Australia, Adobe's photography bundle, which includes Lightroom CC, Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, and Photoshop Express, the mobile app, costs $14.29 a month or $171 a year. Opt for the Lightroom only package and it costs the same but comes with a terabyte of cloud storage space. Meanwhile, an annual subscription for Capture One, which includes Capture One, costs $310 here in Australia, and if I want to buy it outright, it'll cost me $517. Even worse, Capture One recently changed their terms and conditions such that even if you do buy the software outright for $517, that just gets you that point release. If you want to keep your software up to date, you'll have to pay an upgrade fee for every other subsequent point release. No matter how you look at it, the Adobe software is far cheaper and far more capable. When I installed my free trial of Capture One, I was prepared to be wowed. I'm always on the lookout for software that lets me get the most out of my photographs, and I had high hopes for this classic application. Unfortunately, it turned out that most of what I'd read online in the blog articles and the comments section below them was complete and utter bollocks. There is absolutely nothing to recommend Capture One over Adobe Lightroom for the vast majority of photographers. I'm no studio photographer, but Capture One users are always banging on about tethered shooting. Well, Lightroom does tethered either directly or via a watch folder and has done for many years, so what's the big deal? In my opinion, Capture One is the most overrated RAW editor on the market. Its demosaicing algorithm isn't great. It lacks the vast majority of useful features found in other apps. Its masking functionality doesn't appear to have changed in decades. It's painfully slow, and it costs far more than the equivalent Adobe software. I'm prepared to believe that it made sense to switch from Lightroom to Capture One back in 2011 when Adobe introduced their subscription licensing model and Lightroom was a lot more primitive. But I'll tell you what, Lightroom has changed, evolved and improved massively in the decades since then, and as far as I can see, apart from a couple of minor tweaks, Capture One's pretty much stood still. If you want an industry-leading pure RAW editor with a simple asset management tool that you can buy outright, then I highly recommend you look at DxO Photolab. If you want more flexibility and access to modern features such as AI masking, then you should get the Adobe Photography Suite. And if you like whipping your genitals with barbed wire or punching yourself in the face with a cactus, then by all means get Capture One. Alrighty guys, that'll do us for this video. Are you a happy Capture One user? Or are you perhaps someone who used to be and then switched back to Adobe? Let me know in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and remember to subscribe for more down-to-earth, honest photography and drone-related content from me, telling you how it is. Till the next time guys, ta-ta.